David had been living in that shared house for 6 months, and honestly, those 6 months felt like 6 years. After his divorce, everything in his life had changed. The apartment he loved was gone. The routine he knew was shattered. Even the simple things, like knowing where his favorite coffee mug was, didn't exist anymore. At 34, he found himself starting over, living with strangers and wondering how his life had gotten to this point. The house itself wasn't bad. It was one of those older buildings with creaky wooden floors and walls that were just thin enough to hear conversations from the next room if someone spoke too loudly. There were 4 people living there, including him. He'd see them in the kitchen sometimes, maybe exchange a quick hello in the hallway, but that was about it. David wasn't trying to be unfriendly. He just didn't have the energy for new relationships. His tank was empty. His days followed the same pattern. Wake up early, make coffee, head to his small room that doubled as his office, and work on graphic design projects until his eyes burned. He'd take breaks to eat something quick, usually standing at the kitchen counter, then go back to work. By evening, he'd be exhausted enough to fall asleep without thinking too much about how lonely he felt. It was survival mode, plain and simple. The divorce had been brutal. Not the screaming, throwing things kind of brutal, but the slow, painful kind where 2 people realize they've become strangers living under the same roof. They'd tried to make it work. Counseling, date nights, all of it. But some things just can't be fixed. When it finally ended, David felt relieved and heartbroken at the same time. He'd lost his partner, his best friend, and the future he'd imagined all in one go. His family tried to help, but they didn't really understand. His mom would call every few days asking if he was eating properly and suggesting he join some social club. His brother kept telling him to get back out there and start dating again. They meant well, but their advice just made him feel more alone. Nobody seemed to get that he wasn't ready to bounce back. He needed time to figure out who he was outside of that marriage. Work became his escape. He'd always been good at graphic design, and now he threw himself into it completely. Clients loved his dedication, not knowing it came from a desperate need to keep his mind occupied. When he was working on a logo or designing a website, he could forget about everything else. The problems he solved on his computer were manageable, unlike the mess of his personal life. Then one day in late spring, things changed. He came home from a coffee shop where he'd been working and noticed boxes in the hallway. Someone new was moving in. He didn't pay much attention at first. New roommates came and went in shared houses. It was just part of the deal. He grabbed his mail and headed to his room, ready for another evening of work and solitude. That night, around 11, he went to the kitchen to make some tea. That's when he met her. She was standing by the sink, filling a glass with water, looking just as tired as he felt. She had dark circles under her eyes, and her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. When she noticed him, she gave a small, polite smile. "Hey, I'm the new person next door. Just moved in today," she said, her voice quiet but friendly. "David, I'm in the room on the other side of you," he replied, filling the kettle. They stood there in that awkward way strangers do, not quite sure whether to leave or keep talking. Finally, she broke the silence. "Long day?" she asked. "You could say that." "You? Moving is exhausting. I forgot how much I hate it." She laughed a little, and it was a genuine sound, not forced. They ended up talking for 20 minutes. Nothing deep, just the basics. She'd moved to the city for a new job. She was starting fresh after leaving a bad situation. She liked the neighborhood so far. The conversation was easy, comfortable even, and when David finally went back to his room, he realized it was the first real conversation he'd had in weeks that wasn't about work. Over the next few days, they kept running into each other. The kitchen became their meeting spot. Sometimes it was early morning when they were both making coffee. Other times it was late at night when neither of them could sleep. They'd talk about simple things. The weather, the noisy neighbors upstairs, recommendations for good places to eat nearby. Nothing too personal, but it was nice. It reminded David that human connection didn't have to be complicated or painful. About 2 weeks after she moved in, they had their first real conversation. It was one of those Friday nights when everyone else seemed to be out having fun, and they were both home alone. David was in the kitchen making dinner, just pasta with some vegetables, nothing fancy. She came in looking stressed, opened the fridge, stared at it for a minute, then closed it without taking anything. "Rough week?" he asked. She looked at him and something in her expression just cracked. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who's been there," he said, and meant it. She sat down at the kitchen table and he ended up making enough pasta for both of them. They ate together, and she told him about her week. Her new job was harder than expected. She was dealing with some difficult stuff from her past that kept popping up. She felt overwhelmed and alone in a new city where she didn't know anyone. David listened, really listened, and then he shared his own story. The divorce, the starting over, the feeling of being adrift. It felt strange to open up to someone he barely knew, but also freeing. She didn't judge him or try to fix everything. She just understood. That night marked a shift. They became friends, real friends. Not just polite roommates who chatted occasionally, but people who genuinely cared about each other. They started having dinner together a few times a week. They'd watch movies in the living room when the house was quiet. They'd text each other funny things during the day, or vent about frustrating clients and co-workers. For the first time since his divorce, David felt like he had someone in his corner. Someone who got it, and she seemed to feel the same way. They both knew what it was like to have your life fall apart and to be picking up the pieces. That shared understanding created a bond that grew stronger with each passing week. David found himself looking forward to coming home, knowing she might be there. He'd listen for sounds from her room, hoping she'd come out so they could talk. He started noticing little things about her, like how she always tucked her hair behind her left ear when she was thinking, or how she made this quiet humming sound when she was happy. These observations worried him a bit because he recognized what they meant. He was developing feelings, and that was dangerous territory. He'd tell himself it was just friendship. She was going through a tough time, and so was he. They were supporting each other, that's all. But late at night, alone in his room, he'd admit to himself that it felt like more. He cared about her in a way that went beyond casual friendship. The thought of her being upset would keep him awake. Making her laugh became the highlight of his day, but he kept these feelings locked away. The last thing he wanted was to ruin the one good thing in his life by making it complicated. She trusted him as a friend, and he wasn't going to betray that trust by putting his feelings on her. Besides, he wasn't sure he was ready for anything more. His heart was still healing, still figuring out how to trust again. So they continued as friends, growing closer each day, both carrying their own emotional baggage, both finding comfort in each other's company. Neither of them knew that everything was about to change in ways they couldn't imagine. Sometimes the most important moments in our lives come when we least expect them. And for David and his new friend, that moment was coming soon. 3 months passed, and their friendship had become the best part of both their lives. David couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this connected to someone. They had inside jokes now, knew each other's coffee orders by heart, and could read each other's moods with just a glance. It was the kind of friendship that felt natural, like they'd known each other for years instead of months. But around the start of summer, David started noticing changes in her. The woman who used to light up when talking about her day started coming home looking exhausted and defeated. She'd skip their usual dinner hangouts, saying she wasn't hungry. He'd hear her pacing in her room at odd hours of the night. The laughter that used to come so easily was becoming rare. At first, he gave her space, thinking maybe she just needed some time to herself. Everyone has rough patches, right? But as the days went on, it got worse. She'd go straight to her room after work and wouldn't come out. When he did see her, she looked like she hadn't slept properly in days. The dark circles under her eyes got deeper, and she'd lost weight. It was obvious something was seriously wrong. David tried asking if she was okay, but she'd brush it off with a quick, "I'm fine," and change the subject. He knew that wasn't true, but he also didn't want to push too hard. They were close, but there were still boundaries, still parts of their lives they kept private. He worried about her constantly, though. Lying awake at night wondering if he should do more, say more, somehow break through whatever wall she'd built around herself. Her ex-boyfriend, David learned, had been causing problems. She'd mentioned him before, always in passing. Always with this edge to her voice that suggested the relationship had been bad. Now apparently he was calling her constantly, showing up at places he knew she'd be, making her life miserable. She'd changed her number twice, but he always found a way to get the new one. It was harassment, plain and simple, and it was taking a serious toll on her. On top of that, starting over in a new city was harder than she'd expected. She thought a fresh start would solve everything, but instead she felt more isolated than ever. Her family was far away and didn't really understand what she was going through. Her new co-workers were nice enough, but she hadn't made any real friends. Except for David, she was alone, and the weight of that loneliness was crushing her. David felt helpless watching someone he cared about spiral downward. He tried little things to help. He'd leave snacks outside her door with silly notes attached. He'd text her funny memes hoping to get at least a small smile. He'd make extra food and bring it to her, insisting she needed to eat. Sometimes these gestures helped a little. Other times she seemed too lost in her own head to even notice. Then came that night, the one that changed everything between them. It was a Tuesday around 2 a.m. David had fallen asleep at his desk again, woke up with a stiff neck and decided to get some water before properly going to bed. The house was dark and quiet. Everyone else was asleep, or so he thought. When he walked into the kitchen, he found her sitting at the table in the dark. Just sitting there, staring at nothing with tears streaming down her face. She didn't even seem to notice him at first. When she finally looked up and their eyes met, he saw something in her expression that scared him. It wasn't just sadness. It was deeper than that, darker. It was the look of someone who'd reached their breaking point. "Hey," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. "What's going on?" She tried to wipe her tears away quickly, like she could hide what he'd already seen. "Nothing, I'm okay. Just couldn't sleep." David sat down across from her. "We both know that's not true." And then it all came pouring out. Everything she'd been holding in for weeks, maybe longer. She talked about her ex. How he'd made her feel worthless, how he'd manipulated her for years, how she still felt like she was under his control even though she'd left. She talked about feeling like a failure, like she'd made all the wrong choices in life. She talked about the crushing loneliness of being in a city where nobody really knew her, where she felt invisible. "I don't even know who I am anymore," she said, her voice breaking. "I feel completely lost. Every person I've ever trusted has ended up hurting me. I don't know how to trust anyone, including myself. Some days I wonder if things would be better if I just disappeared." That last part hit David like a punch to the gut. He reached across the table and took her hand. "Please don't say that. Please don't even think that. Why not?" she asked, and the rawness in her voice nearly broke him. "Give me one good reason why it matters." "Because you matter to me," he said simply. "Because in these past few months you've become one of the most important people in my life. Because I know what it feels like to be where you are right now. And I'm telling you, it gets better. Not quickly, not easily, but it does get better." They sat there for hours. David didn't try to fix anything or offer easy solutions. He just listened as she talked about everything she'd been carrying. Her childhood, past relationships, her fears about the future, all of it. When she'd cry, he'd hand her tissues. When she'd apologize for dumping all this on him, he'd tell her to stop apologizing. This is what friends do. They show up. They listen. They stay. As the sun started coming up, she was exhausted but calmer. The crying had stopped, replaced by this quiet peace that comes after letting everything out. She looked at David with gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "I didn't realize how much I needed someone to just hear me." "Anytime," he meant it. "Seriously, anytime you need to talk, I'm here." She went to her room to try to sleep, and David sat in the kitchen a while longer, processing everything. He was scared for her, but also relieved that she'd finally opened up. Maybe this was the turning point she needed. Maybe now things could start getting better. The next few days were strange. There was this new vulnerability between them, this deeper level of intimacy that comes from sharing the darkest parts of yourself with someone. She seemed lighter somehow, like releasing all that pain had freed up space inside her. They'd catch each other's eyes and share these looks that said more than words could. But David also noticed something else. The way she looked at him had changed. There was this intensity to it now, like she was trying to figure something out. She'd start to say something, then stop herself. She'd reach for his hand, then pull back at the last second. It was like she was wrestling with something internally, some decision she couldn't quite make. He felt it too, this pull between them that was becoming harder to ignore. The boundaries of their friendship were blurring, and they both knew it. Late at night, lying in his room, David would think about her in the next room, just a thin wall between them. He'd wonder if she was thinking about him too. He'd imagine going to her, holding her, telling her everything he felt, but fear held him back. Fear of ruining what they had. Fear of not being ready. Fear of getting hurt again. So he did nothing, just watched and waited as the tension between them built like a storm waiting to break. Neither of them knew it yet, but that storm was about to hit. Sometimes the most profound moments in our lives happen when we're least prepared for them. When two people who've been through so much pain finally reach for each other, something powerful happens, and that's exactly what was about to occur, in a way neither of them expected, on an ordinary Tuesday night that would become anything but ordinary. It was a regular Tuesday evening, or at least it started that way. David had been working on a design project for hours, his eyes tired from staring at the screen, his back aching from sitting in the same position too long. He'd lost track of time the way he often did when he was deep into work. The house was quiet. The other roommates were out or already asleep. It was just him and the glow of his laptop in the dark room. He was adjusting colors on a logo, trying to get the shade of blue just right, when he heard his door open. He didn't turn around immediately, assuming it was one of his roommates looking for something, but then he felt the presence, that awareness you get when someone is standing very still watching you. When David turned around, she was standing just inside his room. The door closed behind her. The light from his laptop cast shadows across her face, but he could see her eyes clearly. They were red from crying, but there was something else there too. A determination, maybe, or a desperation. He couldn't quite tell. "Hey," he said softly, concerned. "What's wrong?" She didn't answer right away. She just stood there, looking at him with an expression that made his heart race. It was vulnerable and brave at the same time, like she was about to jump off a cliff and wasn't sure if she'd fly or fall. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course, anything." She took a step closer. "Have you ever felt so alone that you physically hurt? Like there's this weight pressing down on your chest and you can't breathe?" David nodded slowly. "Yeah, I have. That's how I feel right now. I've been sitting in my room for the past 3 hours and it just kept getting worse. The walls were closing in. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. And I realized something." She paused, looking down at her hands. "The only time I don't feel that way is when I'm with you." His breath caught. He didn't know what to say to that, so he stayed quiet, letting her continue. "I know this is weird. I know we're just friends and I shouldn't be here like this. But I need—" She trailed off, struggling to find the words. "I just need to not be alone right now. I need to feel like someone in this world actually cares if I exist." "I do care," David said immediately. "You know I do." She looked up at him then, and there were fresh tears in her eyes. "Can I just be held?" "Just for a while. I don't need anything else. I just need to feel like someone gives enough to hold me together because I can't do it myself anymore." David's heart broke and swelled at the same time. This wasn't about attraction or romance. This was about human connection in its most basic, necessary form. This was about someone who was drowning asking for a lifeline, and he was going to give it to her without hesitation. He stood up from his desk chair and moved to his bed, sitting on the edge. He opened his arms. "Come here." She crossed the room quickly, like she was afraid he might change his mind, and practically collapsed into his embrace. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight, and she buried her face against his chest and started crying. Not quiet tears this time, but deep, body-shaking sobs that came from somewhere raw and broken inside her. David held her through it all. He didn't say anything because sometimes there are no words that help. He just held her, one hand rubbing slow circles on her back, the other cradling her head. He could feel her tears soaking through his shirt. He could feel her whole body trembling, and he just held on, trying to pour every bit of comfort and safety he could into that embrace. Time stopped meaning anything. They could have been there for minutes or hours. Eventually, her crying slowed, then stopped. Her breathing became steadier, but she didn't pull away and he didn't let go. They just stayed there, holding each other in the quiet darkness of his room, with only the glow of his laptop screen providing any light. "I'm sorry," she finally whispered against his chest. "Don't be. I shouldn't have come in here like this. I shouldn't have put this on you." "Stop," he said gently. "There's nothing to apologize for. We all need somebody sometimes. There's no shame in that." She shifted slightly, adjusting her position but still staying in his arms. "Can I tell you something?" "Always. You're the first person in my life who's never asked for anything in return. Everyone else, they'd be nice to me, but they always wanted something. But you've just been there, no expectations, no conditions. Do you know how rare that is?" David thought about that. "I guess I never really thought about it that way. You're my friend. Friends show up for each other. That's just how it works." "No," she said firmly. That's not how it usually works. Usually people keep score. They do something nice and expect you to pay them back somehow. But you never have. You've just given over and over, asking nothing back. That means everything to me. They fell into silence again, but it was comfortable now. The kind of silence that exists between people who understand each other completely. David felt her body relaxing against his, the tension that had been there slowly melting away. His own body was relaxed too, his mind quiet in a way it hadn't been in months. I had this thought earlier, she said after a while, her voice sleepy now. I was sitting in my room feeling like I was completely alone in the universe. And then I remembered that you were right here, just on the other side of this wall. And knowing you were there made the loneliness a little more bearable. Isn't that strange? Not strange at all, David said. I've had the same thought about you. She lifted her head to look at him, and in the dim light their faces were just inches apart. Really? Yeah. On the really bad nights when the divorce stuff hits hard and I feel like I made a mess of my life, I think about you being right next door. It helps. Something passed between them in that moment. A recognition, maybe. An understanding that what they had wasn't just casual friendship. It was deeper than that, more meaningful. They were each other's anchor in storms that threatened to pull them under. Thank you for letting me be here, she whispered. Thank you for holding me. I know I'm a mess right now. You're not a mess. You're human. We're all struggling with something. The brave ones are the people who admit it and ask for help. She smiled a little at that, the first real smile he'd seen from her in days. Then she settled back against him, her head on his chest, his arms around her. They stayed like that as the night deepened. Two broken people finding comfort in each other, proving that sometimes the most healing thing in the world is just knowing you're not alone. Neither of them fell asleep exactly, but they existed in this peaceful in-between state where the rest of the world faded away and nothing mattered except this moment. This connection, this proof that even in the darkest times human kindness and compassion can be a light that guides us through. As the hours passed, David realized something important. This moment, whatever it was, had changed things between them forever. They'd crossed some invisible line, seen each other at their most vulnerable, and chosen to stay. There was no going back to what they were before. They could only move forward, whatever that looked like. And for the first time in a long time, that uncertainty didn't scare him. Because whatever came next, they'd face it together. Two wounded souls who'd found each other at exactly the right time, giving each other exactly what they needed. Sometimes life works out that way. Sometimes the universe puts the right person in your path at the exact moment you need them most. This was one of those times, and both of them knew it, even if they didn't say it out loud. Some truths don't need words. Some truths just exist in the space between heartbeats, in the comfort of arms wrapped tight, in the quiet certainty that you matter to someone, and they matter to you, and that's enough. Morning came slowly, sunlight creeping through the gap in David's curtains. He woke up stiff and uncomfortable, realizing they'd fallen asleep sitting up against the headboard, still holding each other. She was still there, her head on his shoulder, breathing softly. For a moment he just stayed still, not wanting to wake her, not wanting to break whatever spell had kept them safe through the night. But reality has a way of pushing back in, no matter how much we want to stay in a perfect moment. She stirred, lifted her head, and their eyes met. Instantly, her face flushed red with embarrassment. "Oh my God," she said, pulling away quickly. "I can't believe I fell asleep here. I'm so sorry. This is so awkward. I should go." "Hey, wait," David said. But she was already standing up, running her hands through her messy hair, looking anywhere but at him. "There's nothing to be embarrassed about. I literally came into your room crying and made you hold me all night. That's the definition of embarrassing." She headed for the door. "It's not embarrassing," he said more firmly. "You needed support and you asked for it. That took courage. There's nothing wrong with what happened." She paused with her hand on the doorknob, her back to him. I don't want you to think I'm some broken person who can't handle her own life. I don't think that at all. I think you're someone who's been through a lot and is still standing. That's not weak. That's strong." She turned to face him, and he could see the conflict in her eyes. Can we pretend this didn't happen?" "No," David said, and her eyes widened in surprise. "Not because I want to make you uncomfortable, but because it did happen and it meant something. At least to me. You trusted me enough to be vulnerable. That's not something to pretend away." They stared at each other for a long moment. Finally, she nodded slowly. Okay, but can we maybe not talk about it right now? I need to process this. Fair enough. She left, closing the door quietly behind her. David sat on his bed, running his hands over his face, trying to figure out what had just happened and what it meant for them going forward. Everything felt different now. The air itself seemed charged with something new and complicated. The next few days were weird. They'd see each other in the kitchen and exchange awkward hellos. She'd avoid his eyes. He'd search for something to say that would make things normal again but couldn't find the words. The easy comfort they'd shared before seemed gone, replaced by this uncomfortable tension that neither of them knew how to address. But the awkwardness wasn't the only problem. Other people started noticing that something had changed between them. The other roommates picked up on it first. One of them, a guy named Chris who usually kept to himself, made a comment one morning about how David and his neighbor seemed to be spending a lot of time together. The way he said it had implications, suggestions that made David uncomfortable. Then the whispers started. Nothing direct, just those knowing looks and half-heard conversations that stop when you enter a room. In a shared house, privacy is limited. People notice things. They make assumptions, and those assumptions started spreading beyond their home. David's ex-wife somehow heard rumors, maybe through mutual friends, maybe through social media. He wasn't sure, but suddenly his phone was blowing up with angry messages. She accused him of moving on too quickly, of replacing her, of never really caring about their marriage. The messages were cruel and unfair, but they also hit some of his insecurities. Was he ready for this? Whatever this was. For his neighbor, the complications were even worse. Her ex-boyfriend, who'd been harassing her for months, found out somehow that she was close with another man. His calls and messages became more aggressive, more threatening. He showed up at her workplace. He sent flowers to the house with cards that had disturbing messages. She had to get a restraining order, which meant police reports and court dates and reliving trauma she was trying to move past. One evening, about a week after that night, they finally talked about everything. David found her sitting on the front steps of the house, looking exhausted and defeated. He sat down next to her without asking, and they sat in silence for a few minutes before she spoke. "This is a mess," she said simply. "Yeah," David agreed. "Everyone's talking about us. Everyone has opinions about what we are or what we should be. And the worst part is, I don't even know what we are. Do you?" David thought carefully before answering. "I know you're important to me. I know I care about what happens to you. I know that night meant something. But what? What did it mean? Are we friends? Are we more than that? Are we heading somewhere or just confused?" "I don't know," he admitted. "And maybe that's okay for now." She looked at him, frustrated. "How is that okay? Everything is complicated enough without adding this uncertainty on top of it." "Because," David said slowly, working through his thoughts as he spoke, "I think we're both scared. We've both been hurt. We're both trying to heal from things that broke us. And what we have, whatever it is, it matters too much to rush into labeling it just because other people want definitions. So what do? We take it one day at a time. We stop worrying about what everyone else thinks. We figure out what this is based on what we feel, not what we're supposed to feel." She was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. "What if we figure it out and realize we want different things? Then we deal with that when we get there. But we can't let fear of maybe getting hurt stop us from exploring something that could be really good." "You make it sound simple." "It's not simple at all," David said with a small laugh. "It's probably the most complicated thing I've dealt with in years. But I think it's worth figuring out." "Don't you?" She nodded slowly. "Yeah, I do. I'm just scared. Me too. But maybe we can be scared together." They made a decision that night sitting on those steps. They would maintain their boundaries while acknowledging that something deeper was developing between them. They wouldn't rush into anything. They wouldn't let other people's opinions dictate their choices. They'd be honest with each other about what they were feeling and where they were at emotionally. It wasn't a perfect solution, and it didn't make all the complications go away. David still had to deal with angry messages from his ex. She still had to deal with her harassing ex-boyfriend and the stress of the restraining order. The roommates still made comments and gave knowing looks. But somehow knowing they were on the same page about navigating this together made it all more bearable. They started setting intentional time aside to talk about the hard stuff. Every few days they'd check in with each other. "How are you really doing? What are you struggling with? What do you need from me right now? These conversations weren't always easy, but they were honest, and that honesty built a foundation of trust that kept growing stronger. David found himself admiring how she handled everything. Despite all the pressure and complications, she kept showing up. She started therapy to deal with her past trauma. She filed the necessary legal papers to protect herself from her ex. She worked hard at her job even when she was exhausted and stressed. She was fighting for herself in ways she maybe hadn't before, and it was inspiring to watch. She told him once, during one of their late-night conversations, that knowing he believed in her made it easier to believe in herself, that his steady presence gave her courage she didn't know she had. Hearing that made David realize how much power there is in simply being there for someone, in showing up consistently and caring without conditions. As weeks passed, the initial awkwardness faded. They found a new normal that incorporated what had changed between them, while respecting the boundaries they'd set. They were closer than before, more aware of each other, more conscious of the connection they shared. But they also gave each other space to continue their individual healing journeys. Some nights, when things got particularly hard for either of them, they'd repeat that night. Not exactly the same way, but in spirit. She'd knock on his door, or he'd knock on hers, and they'd just be there for each other. Sometimes they'd talk. Sometimes they'd just sit in comfortable silence. Sometimes they'd hold each other, finding comfort in physical closeness that asked for nothing more than presence. And slowly, despite all the complications and external pressures, they both started to heal. Not because of each other exactly, but beside each other. Two people giving each other permission to be broken while also showing each other that broken doesn't mean unfixable. That's maybe the most valuable gift anyone can give. The space to be fully human, fully flawed, fully yourself, and still be accepted. Summer turned to fall, and with the changing seasons came changes in both their lives. The relationship between David and his friend had settled into something unique and hard to define. They were more than friends, but hadn't taken the step to become a couple. They existed in this in-between space that worked for them, even if it confused everyone else. David's healing was progressing in ways he hadn't expected. The raw pain of his divorce had softened into something more manageable. He wasn't angry anymore, just sad sometimes about what could have been. He'd started reconnecting with old friends he'd lost touch with during his marriage. He'd picked up hobbies he'd abandoned. He was rediscovering who he was as an individual, not just as someone's husband. Therapy helped him understand that his worth wasn't tied to his relationship status. He learned to sit with uncomfortable emotions instead of trying to work through them or distract himself. He practiced being kind to himself, something that had never come naturally. And through it all, she was there, cheering him on, celebrating small victories, and reminding him how far he'd come when he couldn't see it himself. She was on her own healing journey. The therapy she'd started was intense and difficult, bringing up painful memories and forcing her to confront patterns she'd been repeating for years. She learned about boundaries and self-worth. She started recognizing manipulative behavior and how to protect herself from it. Her ex-boyfriend eventually stopped harassing her after the restraining order, and with each week that passed without contact, she felt a little more free. She changed in visible ways. The darkness that had shadowed her eyes faded. She smiled more easily. She started taking better care of herself, not because someone told her to, but because she decided she was worth the effort. She made friends at work. She joined a book club. She was building a life that belonged to her, not shaped by anyone else's expectations or demands. They supported each other through all of it, but they also maintained their independence. They weren't enmeshed or codependent. They had separate lives that occasionally intersected in meaningful ways. It was a